The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor flickered, casting an eerie glow on the polished linoleum floor. I stood there, clutching a clipboard to my chest, trying to make myself as small as possible. But it was no use. Brandon's voice boomed through the hallway, each word a dagger aimed at my already fragile self-esteem. "Hey, listen up," he shouted, his face red with anger. "This is a hospital, for crying out loud. We're dealing with people's lives here. Even the tiniest mistake could have serious consequences. This isn't a place for an incompetent high school dropout like you." I felt my cheeks burn with shame. I was working as a medical clerk, a position only secured thanks to Dr. Sullivan's kindness. Brandon was berating me for a mistake I'd made in ordering supplies. It wasn't a major error, but in Brandon's eyes, everything I did was worthy of ridicule. "A dropout like you doesn't belong in healthcare," he continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "Quit already! You're a nuisance to everyone here." I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I was trying my best, but the words got caught in my throat. Instead, I merely mumbled, I understand." As I turned to leave, I caught sight of my reflection in a nearby window. The person staring back at me looked defeated, shoulders slumped and eyes downcast. Was this really who I had become? I shuffled away, Brandon's words echoing in my mind. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of my perceived inadequacy was physically pulling me down. The other hospital staff averted their eyes as I passed, some looking uncomfortable, others seeming almost relieved that they weren't the target of Brandon's wrath today. Just as I was about to round the corner, seeking refuge in the quiet of the supply closet, a commotion erupted behind me. The emergency doors burst open, and a flurry of activity filled the corridor. "Code Blue, we need a surgeon stat," a nurse called out, her voice urgent and strained. I turned to see Dr. Sullivan, the hospital director, rushing towards the scene. His normally calm demeanor was replaced by a look of panic as he frantically asked, "Where is he? He's the only one who can perform this operation. The hospital's future is at stake." Confusion rippled through the gathered staff. Who was Dr. Sullivan talking about? Surely not one of the regular surgeons. They were all accounted for. I watched as Brandon's face turned pale, a dawning realization spreading across his features. His eyes darted towards me, wide with disbelief. In that moment, he seemed to grasp a truth that had eluded him, and everyone else, until now. And thus began an incident that would shake the very foundation of the hospital. My name is Alex Thompson. I'm 30 years old, though the weight of my experiences often makes me feel much older. Brandon was my high school classmate, a fact that never fails to bring back a flood of memories, most of them unpleasant. Talking to Brandon always transports me back to those painful days of adolescence. Back in high school, he excelled in both academics and sports. He was always at the top of the class, admired by teachers and students alike. Now, he's known as an elite surgeon, his reputation preceding him wherever he goes. Unlike me, Brandon was good at everything. He moved through life with an ease that I could only dream of. I guess you could call him a genius, though that word would take on a different meaning as our story unfolded. In contrast, I struggled with things that came naturally to most people. I was often late, forgot things frequently, and couldn't focus during class. My mind would wander, filling with complex equations and abstract concepts that had nothing to do with the lesson at hand. Teachers often scolded me for looking bored or disinterested. "Thompson," they would bark, "pay attention. This isn't advanced calculus, it's basic algebra. Even you should be able to follow along." But that was the problem. It wasn't that I couldn't follow along. It was that my mind had already raced ahead, exploring possibilities and connections that weren't part of the curriculum. How could I explain that the simple equation on the board has sparked a train of thought about non-Euclidean geometry and its applications in theoretical physics? My classmates, of course, had no patience for my peculiarities. Their mockery was relentless and cruel. "Thompson's such a loser, you know," they would say, loud enough for me to hear. "Usually, people like that are at least good at sports or talking to others, but you've got nothing going for you." They were right, in a way. I was a loser by their standards. As Brandon had so eloquently pointed out, I couldn't communicate well, and I was terrible at both sports and conventional studies. I didn't have any skills that society, or at least high school society, valued. I was painfully aware of this. Every day was a reminder of my otherness, my failure to fit into the mold that everyone else seemed to slip into so effortlessly. I knew that when I spoke, it made everyone uncomfortable. My words would come out in a rush, filled with references and connections that no one else could follow. So, I tried to stay quiet and keep to myself as much as possible. I sit at the back of the class, hunched over my notebook, filing page after page with calculations and diagrams that had nothing to do with the lesson. I wish they'd leave me alone, but teenage curiosity and cruelty are a potent combination. "This test was tough," I overheard a classmate say one day after a particularly grueling math exam. "I bet Brandon aced it again, though?" Brandon, never one for false modesty, grinned. "Yeah, well, at least I did better than him," he said, pointing in my direction. I tried to shrink further into my seat, but it was too late. The spotlight of their attention had found me. "True that," another classmate chimed in. "There's no way anyone could score lower than Thompson. Hey, you! What'd you get?" Before I could protest, the classmate had moved to my desk and pulled out my test paper. I watched, helpless, as his eyes widened in disbelief. "Oh man, this guy failed again," he announced to the class, his voice a mixture of disgust and amusement. They passed around my test paper, laughing and calling me stupid and worthless. What they didn't understand, what I couldn't explain, was that I hadn't failed because I didn't know the material. I had failed because I couldn't bring myself to write down the simple, straightforward answers the teacher wanted. Instead, my paper was filled with complex proofs and extrapolations, exploring the underlying principles of the questions and pushing them to their logical extremes. To me, it was beautiful, a symphony of numbers and logic. To them, and to the teacher, it was gibberish. I knew I was no good at being normal. Still, having my very existence denied was painful. I was trying my best, after all. I was trying to see the world the way they did, to flatten my thoughts into the two-dimensional plane of their understanding. But it was like trying to fold a universe into a shoebox. Something always spilled out, messy and incomprehensible. Going to school just to be mocked, it became too much. The constant barrage of insults, the pitying looks from teachers, the suffocating feeling of being trapped in a world that had no place for me, it all became overwhelming. I started skipping classes more and more until I became a complete shut-in. At first, it was just the classes where the mockery was worst. PE, where my lack of coordination made me an easy target, and in English, where my tendency to overthink every word made speaking impossible. But soon, I was missing entire days, then weeks. I'd spend my days at home, losing myself in books about quantum mechanics and neurobiology, fields where my racing thoughts felt at home. But with each passing day, I fell further behind in my regular studies. Eventually, I didn't have enough credits to pass, and it was certain I'd have to repeat a year. The thought of going through it all again, the mockery, the misunderstanding, the constant feeling of otherness, was more than I could bear. That's when I made the decision that would shape the course of my life. I decided to drop out of high school. The day I made my decision, I remember sitting across from my parents at our kitchen table. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows across their worried faces. "Alex," my mother began, her voice gentle but strained. "Are you sure about this? Dropping out of high school, it's a big decision. It could affect your whole future." I nodded, my eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden table. "I'm sure," I said quietly. "I can't go back there. I just can't." My father leaned forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "Son, we know it's been tough for you, but surely there's another way. What about changing schools, or maybe we could get you a tutor?" I shook my head. "It's not the school, Dad. It's me. I don't fit in anywhere. I can't think the way they want me to think. I can't be what they want me to be." "But Alex," my mother interjected, "you're so smart. Your teachers always said you had potential. If you could just apply yourself." "Apply myself?" I interrupted, a rare spark of anger flaring in my chest. "Don't you think I've been trying? Every day, I go to that place and I try to squeeze my thoughts into their tiny boxes. I try to care about pop quizzes and prom committees and who's dating who, but I can't. My mind doesn't work that way." My parents exchanged a worried glance. "Then how does it work, Alex?" my father asked softly. "Help us understand." I took a deep breath, trying to find the words to explain something I barely understood myself. "It's like, imagine you're at a concert," I began. "Everyone else is listening to the music, enjoying the melody. But for me, it's like I can hear every individual instrument, every note, all at once. I can see how they all fit together, how changing one tiny thing would alter the whole composition. It's beautiful and overwhelming and terrifying all at the same time. And when I try to explain what I'm hearing, everyone looks at me like I'm crazy." My mother reaches across the table and took my hand. "Oh, Alex," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We had no idea you were struggling so much." "We want to help you, son," my father added. "But dropping out, are you sure that's the answer?" I nodded again, more firmly this time. "I need to find my own path," I said. "I don't know where it will lead, but I know it doesn't go through that high school." There was a long moment of silence as my parents digested my words. Finally, my father spoke. "All right," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "If this is what you truly believe is best, we'll support you. But promise us something, Alex." "What's that?" I asked. "Promise us you won't give up on learning," he said. "Your mind is a gift, even if it doesn't fit into the traditional education system. Promise us you'll keep exploring, keep growing." I felt a weight lift from my shoulders as I realized they were beginning to understand. "I promise," I said, and a small smile, a small tugging at the corners of my mouth. "I'll never stop learning. I just need to do it in my own way." And so, with my parents' reluctant blessing, I left high school behind. It was a decision that would set me on a path I could never have imagined, a path that would eventually lead me back to the hospital corridor, face to face with my past and my future. Years passed, and I found myself working at a hospital, but I only do clerical work. And even then, it's just simple tasks usually given to new hires. I learned from the younger clerks, but even this basic medical office work is difficult for me. It's my first time doing medical clerical work, and I'm not used to being taught by others. The structured environment of the hospital, with its strict protocols and hierarchies, is a constant challenge for my freewheeling mind. I try to choose my words carefully to avoid making others uncomfortable and ask questions cautiously, but even simple interactions often leave me feeling like I'm speaking a different language. "Is this the exact product name or a general term?" I asked one day, pointing to an item on a supply list. The clerk training me sighed, exasperation clear in her voice. That's not what we're talking about right now. Let me explain from the beginning." I've done it again. My mind had jumped ahead, making connections that weren't relevant to the immediate task. No matter how careful I am, I always end up making others uncomfortable. It's been like this for as long as I can remember. One day, I almost made a mistake in ordering supplies. Well, to be precise, one of the clerks who was teaching me caught it just before I placed the order. "Look," she said, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Why are you ordering so much gauze? We have limited storage space, you know." "I'm sorry," I mumbled, my cheeks burning with shame. In my mind, I had been calculating the hospital's gauze usage rate, factoring in potential emergencies and supply chain disruptions. But I realized now that wasn't my job. I was supposed to simply follow the established ordering protocol. And didn't I tell you to always check with me before placing an order?" the clerk continued. "Don't try to do things on your own." As I was being lectured, a doctor who happened to be nearby intervened. He was tall and confident with a crisp white coat and an air of authority. "Come on, take it easy," he said to the clerk. "He's new. Don't be so harsh. You need to be more careful too. This is a hospital after all." The doctor trailed off, his eyes narrowing as he looked at me more closely. "Wait, you look familiar. What's your name?" "Alex Thompson," I replied, bracing myself for the recognition I knew would follow. "Thompson? Oh, that Thompson! It's me, Brandon Carter." My heart sank. Brandon. Of course it was Brandon. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. "Brandon!" I managed to choke out, memories of high school flooding back in a dizzying rush. The elite Brandon, the golden boy who had everything I lacked: confidence, charisma, the ability to navigate the social world with ease, and now, it appeared, a successful medical career. Brandon's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're doing medical clerical work? You? The high school dropout? Give me a break. I know we're short-staffed, but hiring someone like you?" He shook his head, a mixture of amusement and disdain on his face. "Have you at least learned basic addition and multiplication by now?" I felt my face grow hot with humiliation. "At least that much," I muttered, wishing I could disappear. The clerk who had been training me looked between us, confusion evident on her face. "Do you know him, Dr. Carter?" Brandon laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. It was the same laugh I had heard so many times in high school, usually followed by some cutting remark at my expense. "Yeah, he was my classmate in high school," Brandon explained, his voice dripping with condescension. "A total loser with no talent whatsoever. I'd rather not be associated with him." He turned to the clerk, his voice filled with mock sympathy. "Must be tough for you to have to train this guy. You have my deepest sympathies." I stood there, rooted to the spot as Brandon's words washed over me. It was like being back in high school all over again, small and insignificant in the face of his casual cruelty. "Oops, time for the conference," Brandon said suddenly, glancing at his watch. "Gotta run." And with that, he was gone, leaving behind a wake of uncomfortable silence and my shattered dignity. As the clerk and I watched him stride away, I couldn't help but marvel at the twist of fate that had brought us together again. Brandon really is impressive, I thought to myself. I never imagined he'd become such a distinguished doctor. Compared to him, I'm, what, a failure? A cautionary tale? The punchline to a joke about wasted potential? The clerk's voice broke into my thoughts. "Wow," she said, her tone a mixture of awe and pity. "I had no idea Dr. Carter knew you. He's amazing, isn't he? A jack-of-all-trades surgeon. He's mastered a wide range of specialties." I nodded mutely, not trusting myself to speak. Yes, Brandon was amazing. He always had been. And I was still the same Alex Thompson, struggling to find my place in a world that seemed determined to reject me. From then on, every time we crossed paths in the hospital, Brandon would call out to me. His words, sharp and cutting, would slice through the hustle and bustle of the hospital corridors. Hey, Thompson, not causing any trouble, are you? Try not to be a burden, will you? You're useless after all. Each encounter left me feeling smaller, more insignificant. I tried to focus on my work, on the simple tasks that seemed to confound me at every turn, but Brandon's voice would echo in my mind, a constant reminder of my perceived inadequacy. I bet you're just here to create more work for everyone. Think about the inconvenience you're causing others. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I was trying my best, but the words would catch in my throat, trapped behind years of self-doubt and insecurity. I hear there's a weird guy lurking around the hospital, some high school dropout who can't do anything right. He'd throw these insults at me and walk away before I could respond. Even if I had time to reply, I wouldn't know what to say. How could I explain that my mind, which seemed so useless in this environment, was capable of so much more? That the calculations and theories swirling in my head would revolutionize medicine if only I could find a way to express them. Still, every jab felt like a needle in my heart. I started to lose focus at work. Even when people tried to teach me, Brandon's hurtful words would echo in my mind, making it hard to concentrate on what they were saying. One particularly difficult day, I found myself in a quiet corner of the hospital, trying to gather my thoughts. The weight of Brandon's constant criticism, combined with my own feelings of inadequacy, felt crushing. A gentle voice broke into my reverie. "Are you all right, young man?" I looked up to see an elderly patient in a wheelchair. "Are you all right, young man?" I looked up to see an elderly patient in a wheelchair, her kind eyes filled with concern. For a moment, I was tempted to brush off her question with a polite lie, but something in her gaze made me pause. "I'm not sure," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The old woman smiled softly. "You know, I've been in and out of hospitals for longer than you've been alive," she said. "And in all that time, I've learned that everyone here has a story. Everyone has struggles that others can't see." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Even the big shots," she continued, a twinkle in her eye. "Especially the big shots, if you ask me. The ones who strut around like they own the place, they're often the most insecure of all." Her words made me think of Brandon, of the contempt in his voice when he spoke to me. Could it be that his behavior stemmed from his own insecurities? "But you," the old woman said, reaching out to pat my hand. "You have kind eyes. I can see that you care, even if you're struggling. That's worth more than you know in a place like this." Her words touched something deep inside me, a part of myself I had almost forgotten existed. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt seen, not as a failure or a burden, but as a person with value. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. The old woman smiled again. "You're welcome, dear. Now, I think it's time for my medication. Could you be a dear and fetch a nurse for me?" I nodded, grateful for the opportunity to help. As I walked away to find a nurse, I felt a small spark of hope flickering in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, I did have a place here after all. But that spark was quickly extinguished as I rounded a corner and came face to face with Brandon once again. "Well, well," he sneered. "If it isn't the hospital's very own charity case. Tell me, Thompson, have you managed to do anything right today?" I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him about the kind words of the elderly patient, but no sound came out. Brandon's mocking laughter filled the silence. "That's what I thought," he said, shaking his head. "You know, I'm starting to think keeping you around is more trouble than it's worth. Maybe it's time you found a job more suited to your limited abilities." As he walked away, his words ringing in my ears, I felt the small flame of hope flicker and die. Maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't belong here after all. The next day, as I arrived at work, I spotted Dr. Sullivan. He's the director of this hospital, a man I had only seen from afar, his reputation for kindness and wisdom preceding him. Gathering what little courage I had left, I called out to him. Director? Dr. Sullivan turned, his eyes kind but distracted. I'm about to leave for a conference. Is it urgent? I'm sorry, I stammered, trying to find the words to explain my situation. To tell him about Brandon's harassment. Dr. Sullivan's expression softened slightly as he saw my distress. I see. I apologize, but I can't address this right away. I'm in a hurry, so if you'll excuse me. And with that, the director hurried off, leaving me standing alone in the corridor, my unspoken plea hanging in the air. At this point, I felt like I had no one to turn to. The weight of my struggles, of Brandon's constant criticism, of my own self-doubt, felt overwhelming. I felt mentally cornered, trapped in a situation I couldn't see a way out of. In this state of mind, there was no way I could perform well at work. And sure enough, I made a mistake in entering inventory numbers. It wasn't a major error, but in my current state, it felt like the final nail in the coffin of my attempts to fit in. The clerk training me noticed it almost immediately. Mr. Thompson, you did it again! How many times do I have to tell you? How many times do I have to tell you? I braced myself for another lecture, feeling my cheeks burn with shame. I messed up again. I'm sorry. The words stuck in my throat, unspoken. What did he do now? That sudden voice sent a chill down my spine. I turned around to see Brandon, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and triumph. Hey, do you even get it? Brandon's voice rose, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. This is a hospital, you know. We're dealing with people's lives here. Having a carefree and careless person like you around is a real pain for us. Even small mistakes can lead to some serious problems. I wanted to explain myself, to defend myself, but the words wouldn't come. Brandon's voice grew louder, more insistent. This isn't a place for incompetent people. Just quit already. Go work somewhere more suited to your level. But I finally got this chance, I managed to whisper, thinking of Dr. Sullivan's kindness in giving me this opportunity. Brandon's face reddened with anger. I don't care about your circumstances, he shouted. Then, to my horror, he turned to address the growing crowd of onlookers. Hey, everyone, listen up. Thompson has something to say to you all. Brandon took a deep breath, his eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction. Come on, tell them you're quitting. Say that you're incompetent and can't do anything right. Say you're sorry for causing so much trouble. I stood there, frozen, as Brandon's words washed over me. The faces of my coworkers blurred together, a sea of pity and discomfort. In that moment, I felt more alone than I ever had before. Should I say it to you? Brandon continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. It'd be an honor for a high school dropout like you to have me speak on your behalf, right? Or is that too presumptuous? You could say it yourself. Come on, hurry up. It's true that I made a mistake, and it's my fault, but I don't want to quit. The thought of giving up, of proving Brandon right, made my stomach churn. But as I looked around at the faces of my coworkers, at Brandon's triumphant sneer, I felt my resolve crumble. No, I can't take this anymore. Brandon is right. If I stay here, I'll just cause trouble for everyone. The weight of failure, of not belonging, felt crushing. I'll quit, I said, my voice barely audible. Brandon's face lit up with a twisted sort of joy. Hey, everyone! Did you hear that? He announced, his voice ringing through the corridor. Now get out of here! See ya! And just like that, it was over. I ended up quitting the hospital I had just joined after only a week. As I walked out of the hospital doors for what I thought would be the last time, Brandon's words echoed in my mind. Maybe I really can't do anything right. When I got home, I collapsed onto my bed, overwhelmed by the events of the day. No matter what I did, whether I was asleep or awake, I was constantly plagued by self-loathing. The equations and theories that usually filled my mind were drowned out by a chorus of doubts and insecurities. About 3 days passed in a haze of depression. I spent the whole time just zoning out at home. I couldn't bring myself to do anything. The world outside my small apartment seemed distant and unreal, like a TV show playing in another room. On the third day, as I sat staring blankly at the wall, my phone rang. I almost ignored it, but something made me reach out and answer. "Hello?" I said, my voice hoarse from disuse. "What are you doing?" The angry voice on the other end made me sit up straight. It was Dr. Sullivan. "Come in right away." It was a short, angry call that left me reeling. I guess suddenly disappearing without any proper procedures would cause all sorts of complications. Guilt washed over me as I realized the trouble I must have caused. As instructed, I went to the hospital and headed to the director's office. My feet felt heavy as I walked through the familiar corridors, painfully aware of the curious and sometimes hostile glances from my former coworkers. When I entered Dr. Sullivan's office, I was surprised to see Brandon there too. He had an awkward look on his face, a far cry from his usual confident demeanor. "I've heard most of the story," he began, his voice grave. "But Alex, that wasn't right of you. We can't have you quitting without proper notice. It causes a lot of problems for everyone." I hung my head, shame burning in my cheeks. "I'm sorry, Director. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Dr. Sullivan nodded, then turned his attention to Brandon. "And Brandon, what you've been doing is harassment, and you don't have the authority to do that either." Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "With all due respect, Director," he said, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. "As I mentioned, he was my classmate in high school. He hasn't grown at all since then. In other words, there's no hope for him to improve. I was just trying to eliminate the risk of a medical accident." Dr. Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "I see. And you think bullying and public humiliation are appropriate ways to manage staff?" Brandon had the grace to look ashamed. I may have gone too far," he admitted reluctantly. "You're right about that," Dr. Sullivan said firmly. Then he turned back to me. "Alex, I can't let you continue with clerical work." My heart sank. So this was it. I was being fired officially. I braced myself for the final blow. Brandon, seemingly unable to help himself, chimed in. "See, Thompson, did you bring your resignation letter?" But Dr. Sullivan held up a hand, silencing Brandon. "Wait a minute, Brandon. Why are you trying to make him resign?" Brandon looked confused. "Well, Director, you just said—" "I went out of my way to ask him to come here," Dr. Sullivan interrupted. "I should have explained better, but he is—" At that moment, an announcement for an emergency patient rang out, cutting through the tension in the room. Brandon was called too. Their expressions changed instantly, professionalism taking over. I followed along with the flow, caught up in the sudden urgency. As we went through the corridors, I could hear snippets of conversation about the incoming patient. It was an emergency surgery. The patient was a man in his 50s, sudden paralysis, speech difficulties, and loss of consciousness. The symptoms pointing to one thing: a stroke. As we reached the emergency room, the atmosphere was tense. Nurses and doctors moved with practiced efficiency, their voices clipped and professional. "Consciousness level 3 on the Glasgow coma scale," one nurse called out. "What about his vitals?" another responded. In the midst of this controlled chaos, I watched Brandon quickly grasp the situation. His earlier awkwardness was gone, replaced by the confidence of a skilled surgeon. Which OR is open? He barked. OR, came the immediate response. All right, let's do this. Brandon was fired up. As the team prepared to move the patient to the operating room, Dr. Sullivan's voice cut through the noise. Alex, I'm counting on you. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at Dr. Sullivan, sure I must have misheard. But his eyes were locked on mine, his expression serious and expectant. Director? Brandon's voice was filled with disbelief and a hint of panic. But Dr. Sullivan's voice remained on me. This is no time for jokes. In Japan, you're the only one who can perform this operation. I'm counting on you, Alex. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The bustle of the emergency room faded into the background as I processed Dr. Sullivan's words. Me? Perform the operation? But I was just a clerk, a dropout, a failure. Then, something shifted inside me. It was as if a fog had lifted, revealing a part of myself I had long forgotten. Knowledge and confidence flowed through me, pushing aside the doubts and insecurities that had plagued me for so long. Understood, I heard myself say, my voice calm and assured. Director? Brandon's voice was higher now, tinged with panic and confusion. But there was no time for explanations. The patient needed immediate attention. With the clarity I hadn't felt in years, I began issuing orders. Brandon, you'll assist me, I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. We need to move quickly. Let's go. As we scrubbed in for surgery, I could feel Brandon's eyes on me, filled with questions and disbelief. But to his credit, he followed my lead, his professional training overriding his personal feelings. For me, it wasn't a particularly difficult operation. As we worked, my mind was clear, focused. The complex interplay of neurons and blood vessels that had always fascinated me now guided my hands with unerring precision. I made incisions with confidence, my movements swift and sure. As we progressed, I found myself explaining each step to Brandon, my words flowing easily for the first time in years. We need to be careful here, I said as we approached a particularly delicate area. The blockage is close to a major artery. One wrong move could cause catastrophic bleeding. Brandon nodded, his earlier hostility replaced by rapt attention. I've never seen this approach before, he admitted. Where did you learn this technique? A small smile played at the corners of my mouth behind my surgical mask. I developed it, I said simply. It's based on a theory I've been working on about the relationship between blood flow and neuroplasticity. Brandon's eyes widened, but he said nothing, focusing instead on following my instructions. As we continued to work, I could see the realization drawing in his eyes. The Alex Thompson he thought he knew, the awkward, incompetent clerk, was gone, replaced by a surgeon of extraordinary skill and knowledge. Hours passed in a blur of concentrated effort. Finally, as I made the last suture, I stepped back from the operating table. We're done, I announced. The operation was successful. The tension in the room broke, replaced by a collective sigh of relief. As we began the process of closing up and moving the patient to recovery, I could feel the weight of unasked questions hanging in the air. After successfully completing the surgery and leaving the operating room, the patient's family was waiting. Their faces were etched with worry and hope, a combination I had seen many times before, though never from this side of the equation. A woman, presumably the patient's wife, rushed forward. Doctor, is my husband all right? Her voice trembled with fear and desperate hope. I took a deep breath, centering myself before I spoke. He's going to be fine, I said, my voice calm and reassuring. His life is not in danger. It's fortunate that he was brought in quickly. Given his condition, there should be no after effects, or if any. They'll be very minor. His rehabilitation should be relatively easy. Thank you so much. The woman's eyes filled with tears of relief. She grabbed my hands, her gratitude palpable. You saved his life. We can't thank you enough. The family thanked me through their tears, their words of gratitude washing over me. It was a strange feeling being on this side of things. For so long, I had been the one causing problems, being a burden. Now, I had helped someone, saved a life. As the family's things continued, I suddenly caught myself. I should have told them we wouldn't know for sure until he regained consciousness. It was a rookie mistake, one that the old Alex Thompson would have made. But now, with my mind clear and focused, I knew better. I should clarify, I added quickly. While the surgery went well and we have every reason to be optimistic, we don't know the full extent of his recovery until he regains consciousness. We'll be monitoring him closely over the next 24 to 48 hours. The family nodded, understanding the caution in my words, but clinging to the hope I had given them. As they were led away to the waiting area, I felt a hand on my arm. It was Brandon, his face a mixture of exhaustion and confusion. "You," he said, his voice low. "Come with me for a second." I nodded, following him to a quiet corner away from the bustle of the post-op area. Brandon's face was serious, his earlier arrogance replaced by a look of genuine bewilderment. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" Brandon ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to reconcile what he had just witnessed with what he thought he knew about me. "I mean, that surgery, those techniques, the way you handled everything. It was like watching a completely different person. How is this possible? You were just a clerk, a dropout." As I braced myself to answer, a familiar voice interrupted us. "It seems everything went well." We turned to see Dr. Sullivan approaching, a knowing smile on his face. "Yes," I replied, feeling a sense of calm confidence I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't a particularly difficult case. Quite typical, actually. "Not difficult, you say?" Brandon sputtered, his eyes wide with disbelief. Dr. Sullivan chuckled softly. "I see. I hadn't explained to Brandon yet." He turned to Brandon, his expression growing serious. "Brandon, I think it's time you understood who Alex really is." And so, Dr. Sullivan began to explain, filling in the gaps of a story that had begun years ago, long before I had stepped foot in this hospital as a clerk. You see, Brandon," Dr. Sullivan began, his voice taking on a tone of gentle admonishment. "Life isn't always as straightforward as we'd like to believe. People are complex, and their stories often have depths we can't see at first glance." Brandon nodded slowly, his eyes darting between Dr. Sullivan and me. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. "Alex's life changed dramatically from a moment you probably don't even remember," Dr. Sullivan continued. "It was during your high school years. Alex's parents, worried about his inability to fit in, brought him to the hospital. Not because he was sick, mind you, just because he seemed different." I felt a lump form in my throat as I remembered that day. The confusion, the fear, the sense of being a puzzle that no one could solve. Despite Alex's protests, his parents insisted on bringing him in. They were worried, you see. Worried about a son who seemed to struggle with things that came so easily to others. Brandon's eyes widened in recognition. I remember. Thompson always seemed to be in his own world. We all thought that he was just slow." Dr. Sullivan nodded gravely. "A common misconception, and a dangerous one. You see, I was the one who examined Alex that day, and what I found was far from what anyone expected." I watched as Brandon leaned in, hanging on Dr. Sullivan's every word. It was strange. "The tests and examinations we ran that day revealed something extraordinary," Dr. Sullivan continued. "The reason why Alex seemed so different was because his mind worked on a level far beyond what we typically encounter." "What do you mean?" Brandon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Sullivan smiled. Alex's IQ was off the charts. So high, in fact, that our standard tests couldn't accurately measure it. But it wasn't just about a number. Alex's mind worked in ways that most of us couldn't even begin to comprehend. The connections he could make, the insights he could draw, they were truly extraordinary. I felt my cheeks grow warm at Dr. Sullivan's words. Even after all this time, it was strange to hear someone speak about my abilities in such glowing terms. But if he was so smart, Brandon interjected, why couldn't he do well in studies? Why did he drop out? Dr. Sullivan's expression grew somber. That's where our education system failed, Alex. You see, for a mind like his, traditional schooling is like asking an eagle to swim. It's not that he couldn't do it, it's that it went against the very nature of how his mind worked. I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. For so long, I had tried to explain this to others, only to be met with confusion or dismissal. Alex's parents were relieved but also confused, Dr. Sullivan continued. They couldn't understand why their brilliant son struggled so much in school. Even I was a bit perplexed at first. He turned to me then, his eyes kind. Alex, would you like to explain? I think Brandon needs to hear this from you. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. It was time to give voice to the experiences I had kept bottled up for so long. You see, Brandon, I began, my voice steady. The answers, they always came in many forms for me. Take a simple question like, what's 1 + 1? Most people would immediately say 2, and that would be correct. But for me, I paused, searching for the right words to explain the complex web of thoughts that such a simple question would trigger in my mind. For me, it's not just 2. It's also 10 in binary. It could be 1001 in a different base system. In fact, it can be infinite. Any number can be an answer to 1 + 1 depending on the mathematical system you're using. Brandon's brow furrowed in confusion. But how is that relevant to a simple math question? I smiled sadly. That's just it. In school, I couldn't figure out which answer was expected. Even if I guessed, the chances of getting it right, at least according to the narrow parameters of the test, were low. And this wasn't just with math. Every question, every concept, would send my mind spiraling into countless possibilities and connections. Dr. Sullivan nodded encouragingly. Go on, Alex. Tell him about the theories you developed. I felt a spark of excitement, the kind I used to feel when exploring new ideas. Well, you see, while everyone else was learning basic algebra, my mind was already exploring non-Euclidean geometry and its applications in theoretical physics. When we studied basic biology, I was developing theories about neuroplasticity and its relationship to blood flow. Theories that I just applied in that surgery. Brandon's eyes widened in astonishment. You mean the techniques you used, you developed those yourself? As a teenager? I nodded. It's not that I was smarter than everyone else, Brandon. It's that my mind worked differently. I couldn't ignore the connections and possibilities that others didn't see. But in a traditional school setting, that was more of a curse than a blessing. Dr. Sullivan placed a hand on my shoulder. That's why I recommended that Alex study abroad. In America, they have systems in place to support gifted individuals like Alex. A special environment, but one that would feel natural for him. So you went to America? Brandon asked, his voice tinged with a mix of awe and something that sounded almost like regret. I nodded. I went with my mother and devoted myself to my studies overseas. Life abroad was like finally being able to breathe after years of drowning. I made friends who could understand me, who didn't think I was strange for the way my mind worked. Inspired by Dr. Sullivan's kindness, I continued, I obtained my medical license while still in high school. I skipped grades and graduated from medical school at the top of my class. My thesis was highly evaluated, but it hasn't yet gained traction in Japan. Brandon shook his head in disbelief. So, all this time, while we thought you were a dropout, you were actually becoming a doctor in America, I finished for him. I specialized in neurosurgery. The complexity of the brain, the intricate dance of neurons and synapses, it fascinated me. It was a field where my unique way of thinking wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. Dr. Sullivan beamed with pride. Alex became a full-fledged neurosurgeon, one of the most promising in his field. And then, when I needed help with a difficult surgery for a politician who had helped me in the past, I knew exactly who to call. I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me as I remembered that call. As a way of repaying my debt to Dr. Sullivan, I agreed without hesitation to return to Japan. But why work as a clerk? Brandon asked, his earlier hostility completely replaced by genuine curiosity. Why put yourself through that? I smiled ruefully. It was my choice. I wanted to get better at interpersonal relationships, to get used to speaking Japanese again in a professional setting. Dr. Sullivan reluctantly agreed to let me work as a medical clerk until it was time for the surgery. Brandon's face fell as the realization of how he had treated me sank in. I had no idea. All this time, I thought... Dr. Sullivan's voice was stern as he addressed Brandon. Brandon, you must never forget human dignity, both as a doctor and as a person. Your treatment of Alex was abysmal. You can't truly engage in healthcare like this. It's not just about fixing illnesses and injuries and calling it a day. Brandon hung his head, looking genuinely ashamed for the first time since I'd known him. You're right, Director. I'm sorry, Thompson. No, Dr. Thompson. I was completely out of line. The director's words resonated with me as well. I'm a neurosurgeon and a highly specialized one at that. But because of that, I can't do much else. I can only save lives in a limited field. It was a humbling realization. We both stood there, hanging our heads like children being scolded by their father. The weight of our mistakes, though very different in nature, felt equally heavy. After a moment of contemplative silence, Dr. Sullivan's tone softened. Alex, if you're willing, why don't you stay at this hospital? Let's lead Japanese healthcare together. Your insights, your unique perspective, they could revolutionize the way we approach patient care. I hesitated. I certainly liked Dr. Sullivan, and the idea of making a difference in my home country was appealing. But no, I said finally, my voice firm but kind. I'll return to America after completing the requested surgery. I've been given a gift. I aim to become a doctor who can lead the world. Dr. Sullivan's eyes lit up with understanding and pride. I see. You've really grown up. You used to be unable to say anything about yourself. You're still working hard, aren't you? I nodded, feeling a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. I still have a long way to go. The director turned to Brandon, his expression serious once more. Brandon, it seems you've become complacent. It's not academic background that heals patients. Moreover, medicine is constantly evolving. If you had been keeping an eye on global cases and doctors, you would have known about Alex long ago. You've been slacking off in your studies, haven't you? Brandon's shoulders slumped. Yes, he admitted quietly. Dr. Sullivan's expression softened. Well, it's been a challenging surgery. I won't say any more. Both of you did well. As we stood there, the three of us, I felt a shift in the air. The hostility and misunderstandings that had defined my relationship with Brandon seemed to dissipate, replaced by a newfound respect and perhaps even the beginnings of understanding. I realized then that everyone has their strengths and weaknesses. I probably won't be able to become an all-around doctor like Dr. Sullivan or Brandon. I can't be the kind of doctor that connects easily with patients or navigates the complex social world of a hospital with ease. But that's precisely why I want to become a specialist in my field of expertise. I want to become the top neurosurgeon and save many people in my own way. My unique way of thinking, which had once been a source of isolation and pain, could now be my greatest asset in pushing the boundaries of medical science. From that day on, Brandon started talking to me as an equal. When my explanations went over his head, he'd ask for clarification patiently. When I struggled to find the right words, he'd wait for me to finish. I only had 3 days left before returning to America after the surgery, but I feel like I spent most of that time with Brandon. We discussed complex medical theories, with me explaining my latest research and Brandon offering insights from his practical experience. It was a collaboration I never thought possible, and it made me happy to think I had made a friend in Japan too. The day after completing the requested surgery, as I finished saying goodbye to the director and left his office, Brandon was waiting outside. His posture was different. Gone was the arrogant stance, replaced by a more humble, open demeanor. "I'd like to see you off," he said, a hint of regret in his voice. "But unfortunately, I'm too busy. Dr. Thompson, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to contact me. No matter how trivial it might seem, I'm here to listen. I bear some responsibility for making your life difficult. Don't hold back." His words caught me off guard. This was a side of Brandon I had never seen before. "Thank you," I replied, genuinely touched. "That means a lot. To think the elite Dr. Carter would say such a thing to me." Brandon's brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean? Are you being sarcastic?" "No, not at all," I hurried to explain, realizing how my words might have sounded. Even now, social interactions could be a bit of a minefield for me. But Brandon's face relaxed into a smile. I know. Let's both do our best, all right?" As I walked out of the hospital for the last time, I felt a sense of closure. Dr. Sullivan, Brandon, they had both played crucial roles in my journey. One had recognized my potential when no one else could see it. The other had inadvertently pushed me to reclaim my true self. Life is still only half over, I thought to myself. What can I do with my abilities? The possibilities seemed endless. Just because you can't do the same things as others doesn't mean you should look down on yourself. It's our differences that become our individuality and our strengths. It's up to us to make the most of them. I believe that if we can accept ourselves without self-blame, we can shine even brighter. Because you are a precious gem waiting to sparkle. As I boarded the plane back to America, I felt a sense of excitement and purpose I hadn't experienced in years. The path ahead was unclear, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it head on. My mind, once a source of isolation, was now my greatest asset, and I was determined to use it to its fullest potential, to push the boundaries of medical science and to help those who, like me, might not fit the conventional mold. The story of Alex Thompson, the misunderstood genius, was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning.